Pokemon is one of the best video game series of all time, with 18 mainline games, including remakes and special editions, all being released from 1996 to 2019. The series sees no signs of stopping, with a new expansion being released for their latest mainline title, Pokemon Sword and Shield, coming right around the corner. Now, I know for a fact that everybody watching this video knows what Pokemon is. Heck, I'm pretty sure your grandma knows what a Pokemon is. Everybody's played a Pokemon game, and everyone knows about the consistent format laid throughout the 18 mainline games. But if you don't, I'll catch you up. In the Pokemon mainline games, you play as an underage teen. Yes, an underage teen. The internet tends to forget that. Anyway, you travel across a region catching and battling with a sorted variety of Pokemon. The game is formatted as a turn-based RPG, allowing the player to attack, switch between Pokemon, and use items whenever necessary. Despite the simplicity of the format, Pokemon welcome complexity with added features like type matchups, individual values, effort values, abilities, natures, held items, and so much more. The games allow every party you make to be completely unique, with every individual Pokemon in the same species having completely different stats from each other. By themselves, the games have huge replayability value, experiencing many important battles with different team setups and variations. Although, despite this, in my opinion, Pokemon has a lot to improve on. Now, before we begin, I want to say that I enjoy Pokemon a lot. I've played almost every mainline game, excluding the original Japanese Generation 1 games and the original Generation 3 games. I know you're not asking, but my first Pokemon game was Pearl. Anyway, as a fan, I want the series to succeed and keep the original splendor that it had when I first played as a kid. Okay, so before we begin, I want to clarify what I mean by changing the Pokemon formula. In my opinion, there are three ways that you could change Pokemon games for the better. You could first change the overworld and how the player interacts with it, create a new mechanic to affect the battle system and how the player approaches situations they find themselves in, or change the formality laid consistently throughout the plots of the mainline Pokemon games. Of course, Game Freak has done this before, but not to the desired effect, at least for me. Don't worry, I'm gonna get to it right now. Game Freak has done multiple things to change up the Pokemon formula to make it more interesting. One of the most notable mechanics was introduced in Generation 6, being Mega Evolution. After completing enough of the story, the player would be tasked with battling Karina, the gym leader of Shellor City, for the right to receive a Mega Bracelet. The battle did come with a caveat, as both trainers would only be allowed to use a Mega Lucario. With this scenario acting as a tutorial for how Mega Evolution works, it's safe to say that this moment was truly epic. Seeing Lucario evolve beyond its final stage was mind-blowing. It was like something out of Dragon Ball. Although, after a while, the player begins to lose interest in these new flashy forms. This is where the downfall of Mega Evolutions can be seen, as after a while, the Mega Evolutions were seen as more of a temporary power-up, changing the stats of your team member for a single battle. Of course, this adds a new layer of team building, with specific special abilities being attached to certain Mega Pokemon, and some Pokemon being even seen as viable during the game's campaign and multiplayer. But after a while, some Pokemon were only used on teams because they could Mega Evolve. Instead of Mega Evolution acting as a standout feature, it became the norm. I guess to better elaborate my point, Mega Evolutions did not cause a complete overhaul of how Pokemon was played. Instead, it acted as a natural progression, something that should have been implemented earlier in the series. Oh wait, stat boosting in Pokemon was already a concept at this point, with some special abilities and moves powering up stats of specific Pokemon. Although Mega Evolution became way more effective with the loss of a held item, the newly Mega Pokemon would no longer burn a turn powering up. They would be allowed to attack on the same turn. I guess to summarize my speech, you could say Mega Evolution acted as, like, X items on steroids, if you will. The very same thing can be said about Z-moves and the Gigantamax or Dynamax forms seen in later titles. All of these power-ups, despite being different in execution, achieve the same thing, changing the role of a Pokemon on a team or boosting stats to your advantage. In the end, these concepts were already in the game with X items and dedicated moves like Power-Up Punch. Some Pokemon even had different roles on a team depending on abilities, natures, and stats. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the end, these concepts were already in the game way before the conception of Mega Evolution, Z-moves, and Gigantamax forms, making them seem like a better streamlined version of the predecessors before them. I guess as someone who doesn't bother to use items or stat boosting moves, you could say that these features were in fact game changing to the Pokemon formula, but it's like finishing a Zelda game without all the upgrades. Both possibilities being optional and dependent on the player, but one being slightly easier than the other. The open world in Pokemon games has mainly stayed consistent throughout the mainline titles, being an area where you can interact with trainers and new Pokemon to add to your party. What I mainly want to focus on is how the player would go about encountering new Pokemon. Up until recently, players would run through dark patches of grass with a random chance to encounter a Pokemon. The patch of grass would contain different encounter rates, determining which Pokemon you would run into. Pokemon Let's Go and Sword and Shield made the system a little bit more bearable, with the idea that Pokemon would spawn anywhere on the entire screen and the player could choose which Pokemon to interact with. Encounter rates were changed to spawn rates, determining how often a particular Pokemon would spawn. Personally, I think that the spawn system is much more intuitive than the encounter system, allowing the player to choose which Pokemon to encounter, depending on how lucky you are, or, of course, flat out ignoring encounters like the Plague. But this is where my issue with the open world begins with the newer generations. Game Freak has a lot more to work with when it comes to designing open worlds. They no longer have to design the map as a system of glorified lines leading from one place to another. I guess what I mean to say is that Game Freak can afford to design a whole Pokemon game reminiscent of Breath of the Wild's open world, a more connected world lacking as many loading screens. Now, before anybody rages about me not mentioning the Wild Area in Sword and Shield, don't worry, I'm going to get to it right now. The Wild Area in Sword and Shield is how my ideal Pokemon game's open world would operate. When I first saw the trailers in the Wild Area, prior to Sword and Shield's release, I thought the whole game was going to be designed like that. But it wasn't. Instead, it kept the same system of separate routes reminiscent of the older games, but had a separate larger area with lots of Pokemon to catch. And when I mean large. With each section having different Pokemon types and species to catch, areas having their own unique climate system affecting spawn rates, and even having NPCs to trigger side quests and other Pokemon staples like the daycare. I definitely have to say that the wild area for me is the best part of Sword and Shield gameplay wise, but despite this, it does have its own faults. With the wild area being able to be explored in about 30 minutes, it seems like a half finished product. Almost like Game Freak wanted the whole experience to be in the wild area, but for some reason couldn't complete it on time for the release date. For me, the wild area seems comparable to Hyrule Field in Ocarina of Time, a huge plot of land at the beginning, but eventually being boiled down to a big plot of land to do jack all in. Of course, there's a lot more to do in the wild area than Hyrule Field. I'm just using it for comparison's sakes. When it comes to the stories in Pokemon, there's not much variety. You get your starter Pokemon, collect all 8 gym badges, beat the Elite Four, and then beat the champion to then become the new champion. You also get to fight against an evil team that plans to do some kind of nefarious deed. While fighting the evil team, the player is able to encounter the legendary that you can encounter on the box art of the game, being able to KO or catch it. I feel like this should be the easiest point to understand. To me, the Pokemon games come across as repetitive, only being able to tell the same story over and over. Of course, each game has different variations of plot depending on the region's rivals and evil teams, with the most memorable plots coming from more interesting character dynamics and relationships than the plot itself. This can be expressed through examples like How, being one of the only rivals that you actually want to see succeed due to his kind nature from Pokemon Sun and Moon, and Team Plasma, an evil team that ironically preached a morally gray message claiming that society itself had its slain Pokemon from Black and White. Alright, this section of the video is where I interject more of my opinion on how I would personally change the Pokemon formula to make the games different but still very Pokemon and enjoyable. Please don't hate me in the comments. The first issue I would want to focus on would be the open world of Pokemon games. To remedy this, I would most likely make an entire Pokemon game with the mindset of making the overworld as close to Breath of the Wild's in design as possible, adopting the strategy of if you can see it, you can climb it. Of course, with this approach to game design, this theoretical Pokemon game wouldn't function the exact same as Breath of the Wild, with movement options becoming more effective with an HM system that would become an integral part of maneuvering around the world. I guess the HM system would be the most comparable to runes in the Breath of the Wild. If you'd want to have a system more reminiscent of a Pokemon game, you could use the ride system in Pokemon Sun and Moon, allowing the player to unlock new rides the more they progress through the story. Of course, the only downside I can see to this open world would be purposely denying the player access to different areas due to not having access to specific ride Pokemon or HMs, in which case you would have all the HMs and ride Pokemon be accessible from the beginning of the game, again, similar to the ruins of Breath of the Wild. Or you could have the items act as an optional power-up. For example, the player would be faced with crossing a large body of water. They would normally be able to cross the river at a set pace, being relatively slow and slightly inconvenient. Although, let's say they had a Lapras ride Pokemon or a Surf HM. The player would then be able to cross the water twice as fast. So, yeah, that's it for this section. Alright, so next is the gameplay and story. I wanted to put these two sections together because both examples I wanted to bring up address both of these issues at the same time. On November 6, 2015, a Pocket Monsters type game developed by Level 5 was released in the States. The game was called Yokai Watch. I was introduced to this series when I first bought a special console and game bundle when I bought a 2DS. I originally thought it was going to be a basic Pokemon ripoff, but it was way different than I thought it was. Don't tell anyone I said this, but I actually enjoyed it way more than Pokemon. Alright, before you crucify me, let me explain. One of the main reasons why I like Yokai Watch is because of how different the game functions in comparison to Pokemon. The player has a much more active role in battle, requiring you to act on your toes. Your yokai attack on their own, so all you need to do is focus on ultimate attacks, using items, targeting specific targets, and purifying your yokai when they become inspirited. Now, I'm pretty sure you have no idea what I'm talking about unless you've played the game yourself, but what I'm trying to say is that the combat system in Yokai Watch takes what Pokemon started and makes it a lot more dependent on the player's ability to juggle tasks and rewards the player's ability to be more proactive in battle. For example, Dr. Madaman, a boss in the first game, has a special move that allows him to heal a tremendous amount of health. But if the player is proactive enough and destroys all the hearts in the area, they can prevent him from healing and for a brief moment also prevent him from attacking, allowing the player to in turn cause lots of damage by spamming their own special abilities. If Pokemon were to adopt a battle system similar to Yokai Watch, then the games would be a lot harder and require the player to have a much more active role in gameplay. Game Freak wouldn't have to change the current system by that much. All they would have to do is add a minigame that the player would partake in during the battle. Maybe to have your selected Pokemon do the highest damage within their damage pool, dodge an attack, or heal a status condition or something. That's really all they had to do. Not only that, but the story in Yokai Watch is a lot different compared to Pokemon. In Yokai Watch, you play as an underage teen. Yes, an underage teen. You then take possession of the Yokai Watch, a magical item that allows you to see, befriend, and battle with yokai. I don't want to spoil the story too much, but all the games have a different story, and they don't all necessarily follow the archetype like Pokemon. But just so you know, Yokai Watch is like the JoJo's of Pokemon-like games. It's very bizarre, funny, and surprisingly casual at times. For my final example, I want to actually bring up a Pokemon spin-off game. With a unique game mechanic so good, it's a huge mystery as to why it never actually showed up in the mainline titles. That game being Pokemon Colosseum. Pokemon Colosseum had a unique story and a new game mechanic called Shadow Pokemon. These new Pokemon were effective on any type when using the newly introduced Shadow moves, although they weren't completely invincible as they were still assigned their purified typing. For example, a Shadow Quilava, obtainable in the first game of Colosseum, had access to a move called Shadow Rush, being effective on every typing with the cost of recoil and a lack of super effectiveness. These Shadow Pokemon had their own sets of rules and could even be purified to become the original counterparts of themselves. Not only that, but Colosseum was the first and only game, ignoring its sequel of course, to allow the player to steal Pokemon from their opponent. It's a hypothetical Pokemon feature that came true, at least in this spin-off series. This point leads to another reason why I enjoy Colosseum even more than some mainline games. The story. In Pokemon Colosseum, you play as an underage teen. Okay, let's move on. I'm pretty sure you already get the joke. Tasked with battling the evil Team Cypher. Team Cypher manufactures Shadow Pokemon by closing the door to its heart. As the protagonist, the player is tasked with stealing the Pokemon back from Team Cypher and purifying them, as Shadow Pokemon themselves are way more aggressive with the possibility of even attacking trainers. Of course, this game does have its faults, as every battle in the series is in fact a double battle. This does slow the pace of the game down dramatically, causing the player to think much harder. I advocate for players having a much more proactive roles in battle, but not to the point where the player thinks 10 minutes straight about their next turn. Not only that, but because of the ability to steal Pokemon from trainers, wild Pokemon and roots were completely removed from the Colosseum games. Of course, with some exceptions. Pokemon Colosseum acts as a drastic change in the Pokemon formula, foregoing the system of gyms and other Pokemon staples to better enrich its anime-like cinematic story. The unique gameplay mechanic of Shadow Pokemon adds a new layer of depth to how the player perceives situations, as Shadow Pokemon have their own sets of rules different from normal typings. The experience acts as a way that Game Freak can truly experiment with the Pokemon formula to make it better while still having the games still feel like they've always felt. Plus, not gonna lie, Shadow Lugia looks so cool. Now you might be saying, oh, Salt Kage, If you're bored of the mainline titles, then why don't you just play spin-offs and that Yokai Watch game? Well, for your information, mainline games can change if gameplay gets too repetitive. Just look at Zelda. Look at how many games keep the same overall gameplay, but dramatically change how the player interacts with the world. From time traveling to form changing masks to even just making the whole overworld a giant body of water. My point is, Pokemon has remained relatively stagnant when it comes to game design. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, am I right? But as someone who's played way too many Pokemon games instead of doing their homework, I feel that a change of the Pokemon formula wouldn't cause fans to lose interest. It might do the opposite. I'm not asking the next Pokemon game to do a complete shift in gameplay and tone. But it should definitely have something that separates it from different titles, not some temporary anime power up or new Pokemon, because we've already seen that. I want something to vitalize the series, capturing the wonder of new players, but also old players who might have lost interest in the series a long time ago. I don't know. Maybe I'm just crazy. Yeah, I'm probably crazy. Alright, thank you for watching this video. Before you go in the comments and be, oh, you stole this idea from Egoraptor. It's just like a sequelitis. Blah, 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 blah. Yes, I understand. This format is very similar to Sequelitis. It's pretty much the same thing, just about Pokemon. You leave me alone now. I really wanted to do something about game design because I love games. But anyways, this is the first video on this channel. There's probably going to be more stuff coming soon. I don't know. Just be on the lookout. So like, subscribe, notification thingy, and share, please. I need friends.